Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm thrilled to talk to Amy Hupe. Amy is a UK-based design systems and content design consultant. Over the past 8 years, she's worked on design systems for some of the biggest names around, including Gov.uk, BT, Springer Nature, the BBC, and the Wellcome Trust. Whether she's leading systems work or designing content, Amy works to champion simplicity and inclusion in the face of increasing complexity. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And today you want to talk to us about watercolor painting.
Yes. And I want to preface that by saying that I know absolutely nothing about any of the technicalities of watercolor painting, and I'm not very good at it.
This puts the whole second part of this conversation, which is a hands-on quiz, in jeopardy.
Oh dear. Okay, well, I'll do my best. I might have to make some things up.
So I always like to start with the origin question. Where does watercolor painting start for you?
Well, I was thinking about this, and it's funny because actually I used to do quite a lot of it when I was a kid many, many years ago, but I just forgot about it really. I remember my auntie, who's quite an artistic person, she bought me like a set of those watercolor pencils where you kind of draw and then you put water over it and it turns it into watercolor. And I spent a whole holiday obsessing over it. I used to get kind of quite hyperfixated on things when I was little. And I remember doing almost nothing but that for a week. And we were in Lanzarote, so I was drawing volcanoes and sunsets and things that I could see there. And then I completely forgot that watercolor was a thing for years and years. And then it was last year, I was having quite a difficult year for a lot of reasons, like personal things that were going on. And I also hit my first kind of point in work where I was struggling to find work as a consultant. So I was sort of trying lots of different things. I was trying to get into something or trying to find a way to kind of use my time when I wasn't working and when I was trying to kind of distract myself from a lot of what was going on. And one of my friends came around one evening and she's quite creative and she was like, oh, why don't we just do some watercolor? I've got some paints, I can bring them around and we can just watch some tutorials on YouTube and just do some easy kind of things. And so we just drew some fruit. And I think it was the first time in, I can't even say how long, that my brain just went quiet while I was doing it. So I was just painting and not painting anything kind of fancy or imaginative because I was watching this paint along thing. And yeah, loved it. Just got really into it and I haven't really looked back. So it's become my thing now that I do whenever I need a bit of a break from the noise of the world or the noise of my brain.
What was about watercolor painting or that specific experience that was different from other hobbies or sort of pastimes that you were looking into?
I think originally it was something that had a nice balance for me of I could, if I was in the mood to, I could kind of freestyle and do something creative and try and paint, you know, whatever I felt like, just experiment with patterns and things like that. And then also if I wasn't feeling very imaginative, it was something where there's like so many tutorials and things on YouTube where you can just go on and kind of search whatever it is you want to paint and you'll find a sort of paint along thing. And so it was nice in that sense for me because some days you're feeling creative and some days you're not really. And for me, it was the kind of act of painting, putting paint on paper that I liked, that took me out of my head. And I didn't always want that to be something that I could only do when I felt creative, if that makes sense. So I liked that aspect of it. I liked the fact that it was something that I could kind of do when I wanted to just be guided and just forget about things. And I liked it that I could do it when I was feeling a bit more creative as well.
Are you a visually creative person?
No, I would say not at all, which is really interesting given the kind of field that I work in, a lot of which is working with very kind of visual people. And I tend to work and think much better in written words. So whether that's kind of reading them or writing them, that's how my brain works. And so quite often in my day-to-day work, I'm confronted with, you know, can we make this more visually appealing somehow? If I'm writing some developer documentation or if I'm giving a presentation or something, it's like, oh, I need this conveyed in a picture format. And I really struggle with that. So it's quite interesting for me that this has become the thing, given that I don't think I'm massively visually creative or much of a visual thinker.
Is visual art something you are interested in, though? Regardless of your history with it?
Yeah, I like looking at it for sure. I don't have much knowledge about it. So I have lots of very creative friends and very arty friends who quite often will take me to kind of art galleries and look at exhibitions and things like that. And I always feel a bit lost in those spaces. I don't really know what I'm looking for, and I struggle to pick up on messages and things conveyed through images. But I like art. I like buying art. It's actually one of the things that over the years, it's become like a little ritual for me. So if I finish a contract or if I win a big contract or something, since I've been a consultant, I have to find ways to celebrate that, because it's not like having a kind of permanent job where you've got the structure of pay rises and bonuses and things like that. And so my way of doing that was to always buy myself a nice piece of art when I finished a contract or something good happened. That's how I would sort of celebrate, and that's what I'd put the money to. So yeah, I like it. I appreciate art, but I couldn't really tell you what I appreciate or what it means, if that makes sense. It's a very kind of personal thing for me, and I suppose I don't engage too much in some people are very knowledgeable, aren't they, I suppose, about artwork, and that's not me really.
So your friend came over.
Yeah.
You tried your hand first time with watercolor painting as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
What happened next?
So as I say, in that moment, it was quite a big thing, because I was having a really difficult time, and I've talked about this a little bit on social media and various places. I have OCD, and when it's bad, my brain tends to go haywire. It's just going all the time. It's very noisy up in my brain, and it's constantly bombarding me with feelings that I have a problem to solve or that there's something wrong. And I was struggling with that quite badly that evening when she came over, and it was just magic. It was the first time, as I say, and I don't know how long, maybe a year at least, that I just experienced this kind of silence where it just took me completely out of my own head, and I was completely focused on something else. And I don't know why watercolour in particular, but it was the only thing I had tried that had been successful in doing that. And it was also accessible for me. It's something I could kind of do at home on my own, whereas I guess some of the other things that I had tried were things that I had to kind of go somewhere and do, or I had to do in a group or with other people. So after that, I just started to do the same kind of thing by myself. So I'd sit at home, I bought myself some paints, and I'd sit at home and watch tutorials on how to paint jellyfish and landscapes and things like that, and just started sort of following along. And then I think when it really became sort of cemented as a thing for me, and this is actually most of what I do now when I paint, is around that time, it was one of my friend's birthdays, and I had this idea that I would paint her a birthday card. And so I did that, and it was nice, and it felt nice to give her something homemade. And I painted something that was kind of to do with a joke that we had between us. And then I started doing that regularly. So I paint pretty much all the birthday cards and cards that I send now. That, I guess, what's made it quite a regular thing for me. It's become something that I can kind of practice regularly, because I'm at that age where lots of people are having babies and getting married and buying houses and things like that. So it's something that I kind of have started doing in that way now.
Something that happens with someone who picks up a new creative hobby, there's the ideal outcome in your mind, but the first time you're doing it, you're probably falling a bit short of what you thought it's going to look like. Yeah. How is that for you?
It's really interesting, because it's the complete antithesis to my personality in general to engage with anything that I'm not immediately good at. And that's not to say that I'm immediately good at most things, because I'm definitely not. But I tend to have a bit of an aversion to things. I'm a real kind of perfectionist, and people often think that means that I make everything perfect or I need everything to be perfect. But in my case, and I think for a lot of people who are perfectionists, it's more that I will not engage with things that I'm not good at. So watercolor was an interesting thing for me, because I'm not very good at it, to be honest. Like, as you say, there's a huge difference between the things that I was looking at for inspiration and then what I was actually producing. And I've got better for sure, but it's not something that I have a kind of natural talent at. I'm sure if you got any real watercolour artist to look at my work, they'd have a lot to say about it and not much positive. But there's a couple of things. One is I don't really know why, but I don't mind that I'm not very good at it. I think I get so much out of the process of it that it's okay. It doesn't matter to me. And because I suppose the things I'm painting for, I'm not really painting to produce artwork for myself or other people. The kind of things that I'm painting are, as I say, lots of cards, which are hopefully meaningful to the people I give them to, but they have a short shelf life. So I know they're not going to sit there on their mantelpiece for the rest of time. And I've started painting kind of bookmarks and things, which are a bit more abstract. So it doesn't really matter if they're not perfect, if that makes sense. And then I think the other thing is that watercolour as a medium is actually very forgiving. So if you're painting with something like acrylic, or if you're doing pencil drawings or sketches or anything like that, you've got much less room for error because it's very obvious. Whereas with watercolour, it's so easy to just like add a bit more water or blend something in or add more colour somewhere. And because of that kind of blending fluid quality of it, I think is a very good thing to start painting with if you're not an experienced painter.
That's really interesting because, again, I see that difference between Amy as a person who writes words and uses language in a very accurate way, most likely, and Amy the painter who is fine with this kind of like amorphous ambiguity.
Yeah, and maybe that's why. Maybe it's a nice antidote to words, which is, have always been kind of my main means of being creative and communicating, and have ended up being a huge part of my work. Where a bit like I was saying with acrylic paint or pen or something, you have to be much more precise. There's much less margin for error. Although I suppose the difference between words and something like that is we're not normally writing by hand, are we? So if I get it wrong, I can rewrite it. Yeah, it is interesting. And it's a strange juxtaposition for me because, as I say, I'm not really a visual person in general. And I'm also not somebody that's very comfortable with being imperfect and getting it wrong and the process of learning something. And it's been really interesting to have something that I've stuck with for a while because I can actually see the progression of my skill over time. I can see myself getting better. If I have most of the painting that I've done. And when I look back at those early ones, they seem quite bad compared to what I'm doing now. And I'm sure in a year's time, it will be different again. And because I'm not someone who usually engages with things that I'm not good at off the bat, I don't really get that experience in my life very often where I feel that I kind of get to develop skills and I get to see something evolving over time. So yeah, it is interesting how much it sort of opposes the other aspects of my personality and my work and the things I'm drawn to.
So looking back at those early drawings from a year ago, where do you see your growth? What do you see? Oh, that I can't believe I did it this way. What is the delta between then and now?
What's the change? It's hard to pinpoint anything in particular. I think before I was interested in making things look accurate. So because I started watching these tutorials and so I was painting fruit and jellyfish and can't remember what some of the other things were, but I was trying to make them look as much like the thing as I could. And I think over time I've got comfortable with being a bit more abstract. And I've kind of, especially through the cards that I've made, I've lent into that idea that it can be quite sweet when it's a bit crap. And, it's like I painted all of my Christmas cards and I regretted that decision by about the second card when I realized how many I had to send. But it's kind of charming in a way if your Christmas tree looks like it was drawn by a child. So I think that maybe I've sort of developed my own style a bit more. I've stopped trying to emulate what other people do and I've stopped trying to make it look realistic. And I've got more comfortable with things looking a bit more playful and a bit more half-baked. And I suppose the other thing that I've done, which I didn't do at the start, was I was trying to stick originally very closely to using watercolour on its own. And over time, I've kind of, through watching other people do it and through just playing around myself, I've learned more about mixing materials and that's okay. So often if I draw something and it doesn't look great, then sometimes I might add a few pen lines or I might add a little bit of white acrylic to it, or I might try adding a texture or something. And sometimes, like one of the most recent things I did involved like cutting up bits of paper and sticking them on and making more of like a collage with the watercolour incorporated into it. So I think I've just got more comfortable with my niche within the watercolour world and a bit more comfortable experimenting, I think, with different things and not worrying too much about sticking to the rules.
How long was it since the first time you painted until you felt comfortable to share your works with other people?
I shared some of it with a few close people straight away. So I'm not, it's strange because when I say that I don't like to do something I'm not immediately good at, it's not really for fear of being judged. It's more that it's uninteresting to me most of the time. If someone's not going to say, oh, that's really good, it's that I don't feel motivated by it. But I think at the time, because it was bringing me out of this quite dark phase in my life, there were a few people that I shared it with, like my dad, for instance, who I pretty much share my entire life with, where it was more just to show him and say, oh, look, I'm doing something positive and I'm doing something creative. So it wasn't about getting a congratulations for the work. It was more what me doing that represented. A few people I shared it with straight away. And then I still don't share a ton of it. I don't post it online or go out of my way to show it to people. I suppose the only time people see it is either if they come to my house and they ask to, or if I am giving them a card directly. And yeah, that kind of latter scenario happened quite quickly because I had, as I say, it was a friend's birthday sort of in the middle of this, and I just thought, oh, it'd be fun to paint her a card. And for reasons that I won't go into here, the card depicted a deliberately very bad drawing of the Queen. And because I was trying to make it look like a very bad drawing of the Queen, it sort of took the pressure off, I suppose. I didn't have to make it look good. So that made it easier.
So how often do you paint these days?
Oh, I did a lot of it over Christmas because I was painting all these cards, and then I was kind of trying to make my own gift tags and things like that. So then I was painting every couple of days, I think, for about a month. And I haven't painted this year so far, but it varies really. I would say on average, like once a week perhaps, and maybe sometimes more, sometimes less. That's the real average, because sometimes it'll be, multiple times a week, and then sometimes I could go for 2 months without doing it. But I quite like that about it. I think that's kind of, in a slightly cringy, poetic way, that's kind of similar to what I was saying about watercolour itself as a medium. Like, it's okay that it's quite fluid and imperfect, and the way that I do it is quite fluid and imperfect, because sometimes I'll really spend a lot of time with it, and sometimes I can go away from it for ages, and then my enthusiasm for it when I come back is still the same. So that's been a really nice aspect of it, again, for me, because it's much more in keeping with my character to only want to do something if I'm going to give it 100% all the time. So it's been nice to have something that I can kind of go away from and come back to.
When you do paint, do you have a ritual around it? Do you have a specific place you sit? Do you have your specific tools or a time of day?
I do, actually. That's funny. I never thought about it. But yeah, I do. It's pretty much always the same. So you pointed out, we were talking just before we got on the recording about where I live, which is a really old house with lots of beams everywhere. And there's a particularly old, slightly spooky, but quite cozy corner in my living room where I've got my dining table. And it's just a big, rickety, like wooden table. And I normally just light a candle there, and then I put a playlist on. And I have this lovely playlist, actually, that was shared with me I went to a life drawing class a few years ago, and they always put on these really nice playlists that have quite a lot of old school jazz on and chill. It's a real mix. It's got kind of like chill dance music on it, and then like lots of very lo-fi kind of beats and old jazz and stuff like that. It's very relaxing. So I often put that on, and then I light my candle, and then I get all my paints out and just sit there and paint. And I can really lose hours there. It's a very, like, almost you go into a bit of a trance is what I find. So yeah, that tends to be what I do. I get a cup of tea, and the other really nice, this is the way that I know it takes me out of myself, is I have a terrible vaping habit. So I quit smoking a couple of years ago, having quit and started again on and off over the years. And I switched to vaping to try and stop me from smoking, and then ended up being far more addicted to vaping than I ever was to smoking, which is not ideal. But when I'm sitting there painting and I'm in that kind of relaxed state, it doesn't even cross my mind to vape. I can just leave my vape on the other side of the room, and I don't think about it, and I don't miss it. And that for me normally would be kind of dead time, sitting around and thinking about vaping and trying not to vape and then going to vape inevitably. So that's my other part of the ritual, is I leave anything distracting out of the way. I put my phone away and stuff like that. So
when you sit down to paint, do you have an idea in mind? Do you have something in mind as you're going to paint, or is it just, the inspiration comes as you're sitting down?
Normally I have something in mind. So I'll normally know what the output is going to be, whether I'm going to paint just a picture, or if I'm sitting down to make somebody a card, or if I am going to make a bookmark or something like that. But then it's quite guided by what starts coming out of the brush, really. So I'll have a kind of rough idea, and then when I start actually painting and things, it might change a bit and morph a bit, especially if I'm doing something slightly more abstract. But a lot of it, like the ideas that I get for it, I just find, I'll kind of normally, if I have a rough idea of what I want to paint, I might just search online for like watercolour, whatever it is, and then collect some ideas together and then try to kind of combine what I like from the different ones. But yeah, sometimes, especially if it's something more abstract, I might just kind of put a few colours down and then see what I feel like adding to it.
Apart from the first time of you painting with your friend, has watercolor painting been a solitary activity for you, or have you shared it with others?
No, it has been pretty well solitary. It's not something I've done with anybody else since I did with my friend. I definitely could still paint with my friend or with anybody. I wouldn't feel weird about that. But yeah, it has evolved into something that I just do on my own by myself, which again is quite nice. I don't have too many things like that. I think I'm quite a sociable person. I would say I'm more extrovert leaning, although I definitely have my moments where I like to be alone. But I think I tend to be a bit more happy and engaged when I'm with other people. So it's nice to have this thing which is just for me, and it's just this kind of quiet space that I get to occupy. So yeah, most of the time it's just me, but I would still happily paint with someone else if they wanted to.
Not to take away from your enjoyment and satisfaction with watercolor painting, but did it give you any appetite to try other types of creative pursuits?
Kind of. It was a real lesson for me. As I say, it was the first time, I suppose, that I've experienced that, being completely taken out of my head and completely absorbed in something. And it's definitely made me more open to other things that do that. So the listeners won't be able to see this, but you can see this collection of Lego plants on my shelf behind me. And that's a new thing. Again, my partner's very into Lego, and it's never interested me at all. And he kept saying, "Oh, it's good. It kind of takes you out of your head, and it's very absorbing and stuff like that." And after I started painting, I thought, "Oh yeah, I'll give it a go and see if it gets my brain to kind of go quiet." And it does. I like it. This in the same sort of way. So obviously, it's a bit more structured and a bit more guided than watercolor. But it's something that still has that same effect of making my brain go quiet. So it's definitely made me more open to things that might do that. And this friend actually that introduced me to the watercoloring, she's a really good person to have around in that sense, because she's always kind of saying, "Oh, let's go and do a pottery class," or "Let's go and do..." In fact, I went and painted mugs with her, and I painted this very poorly painted mug that looks like a child painted it. So yeah, I think there's nothing else that's quite captured my attention the same way that watercolor has, but I think it's changed my attitude to creative pursuits, or things that you do just for the enjoyment of doing them and not with any particular output in mind. Like even writing, I would say historically writing has been my main creative outlet. And if anybody has ever seen my website, you might notice that although it's primarily a kind of work website, and the homepage is very much about the services that I offer and hiring me. If you go into the articles, there's a real mix of work-related things and then more personal things and some more creative things. And writing has always been that for me. It's been that thing that I could do to kind of, I suppose that was my way of being creative before. But a big difference is that even then, even when I'm writing something that might feel quite private to me, I always have the output in mind, and I always have the idea of someone reading it in mind. So it doesn't quite have the same impact. It doesn't take me out of my head in quite the same way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Amy, where can people find you?
I am on all of the internet. So I don't use Twitter anymore. I still have an account there, but I'm not using it for a while now. So the main kind of social media that I use is Blue Sky, where I'm just amyhupe.bsky.social. I am on Mastodon, I'm just Amy Hupe everywhere pretty much. And then my website is probably the best place to find all of the places that I am, which is just amyhupe.co.uk.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.